Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank Jamie Cameron for including me in this terrific day. I know that Jamie's put a lot of work into bringing journalists, academics, and lawyers together to talk about journalism, ethics, and freedom of expression. And I expect we're all going to benefit a lot from thinking about a lot of really big questions today. The big questions we're confronting this morning, I think, are as large as they come, and they're both practical and philosophical. What is journalism? Who is a journalist? Who should practice journalism? What about citizen journalists and bloggers? Is what they're doing journalism? Do journalists require or take for themselves any special entitlements? Or does Canada's charter right to freedom of expression give journalists just about all they need, nothing more and nothing less than any other citizen? These issues are much debated in Canada right now. I think any of us who've worked in this field know that they're perennial issues, but it's kind of heating up. And I would suggest that the lightning rod for this is a report out of Quebec, a recent report that suggests that a distinct professional status for journalists and binding those professional journalists to a code of ethics. I think we need to state at the outset that this proposal has been much misunderstood and perhaps unjustly maligned. So I hope today we can clear up misperceptions and deal in facts, as all good journalists should. This is not a proposal to license journalists, as an editorial in the Globe and Mail said in its first sentence. It is not a proposal to regulate journalists. Its intention is to support public interest investigative reporting, which the commission that looked into the media environment in Quebec sees at risk. I think that risk is something that all of us can identify with right now. Given the amount of misunderstanding about the, quote, Payette report, we're lucky to begin our day with what every journalist seeks, the source of the information herself, the most reliable source one could get. So I'd like to begin by introducing Dominique Payette, the author of the report that's now before the Quebec government. I believe this is the first time that Dominique has spoken about this in Ontario? Yep. Okay, so great. So we decided to start the panel.
Last one.
No. We decided to start the panel by giving Dominique a little bit extra time beyond everyone else, just to outline the state of the media in Quebec and clarify the recommendations that are now before the government. We're aiming to leave a half an hour for questions at the end, so there'll be plenty of time for you to ask her your questions and weigh in as well. So to introduce Dominique, first of all, I apologize for not being bilingual. It's a great embarrassment in a situation like this. Dominique Payette is a professor at the University of Laval, Department of Information and Communications. She's also Associate Director of the university's Master in Public Communications program and manages all the graduate programs. Before joining Laval in 2006, Dominique worked as a journalist for many years at Radio-Canada. Her academic work includes a master's thesis on the professional practices of journalists and a doctoral thesis on the genocide in Rwanda. Welcome, Dominique.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kathy, for this abstract, very well done. And thank you for inviting me. I don't know Jimmy since a very long time, but I know she's something like no is not an answer person. I know that the issue that concerns you today is that of the definition of a journalist. Who is a journalist, you ask yourself, and I know that the part of my working group's recommendations that has caused much ink to be spilled in English Canada was this legal status of professional journalist that we believe necessary and useful to push for today. So please allow me to contextualize this project. The mission was vast, the question both complex and sensitive. We presented the report to Minister Saint-Pierre last January, and the report was exceptionally well received in Quebec. The report was also very well received by the minister, who is in consultation this fall to prepare a bill. I will come back to our primary recommendations, but first let me present our assessment of the general state of the news. In Quebec, I'm always talking of Quebec. I'm not very familiar with the rest of Canada journalism, so this is not a universal project. Just as all studies of this type conducted in Quebec and Canada in the last 40 years have done, we have to say from the outset that the concentration of media ownership in Quebec is a major problem. The lack of competition and diversity of sources that stems from this is a serious issue. But we have seen that no government has deemed such intervention necessary or possible. We therefore wanted to take up the challenge of presenting something different, a new way of approaching the problem without confronting it as directly as those before us, who have only run up against brick walls. What tools do we have to contain the concentration problem and re-establish an equilibrium in this industry? We propose a new pragmatic and coherent contract between the press and the state, the journalist and the citizen, democracy and the news, and between journalists and their employers as well. With no surprise, employers are not so hot to the idea. As in many other places in the world, Quebec's news media are experiencing a significant structural crisis. At the very heart of this transformation is the fact that advertisers have lost interest in the type of news that we call general, so be it socio-political or hard news. In other words, the very news that is crucial for the political and social debate that forms the foundation of democracy. We call this kind of news public interest news. It's also the most expensive kind of news to provide. It's primarily based on on-the-ground features by reporters or in-depth research and investigation, which demands much time and doesn't always pay, especially over the short term. Financing for such investment no longer comes from advertising, as it did under the traditional general mass media economic model. Everything worked well for 100 years or so, and extremely rich and powerful media groups were built on this model, guaranteeing high-quality public interest news in the service of democratic interest. Everybody won. Advertisers aimed at the masses, enriched them, companies made money, and journalists could have ambitious projects financed. But today's advertisers demand targeted markets, immediately quantifiable results, like the number of clicks of an internet site, for example. And they have dropped out of the general news game, which does not meet such criteria. Today, mainly to avoid the production costs of public interest news, the number of players dedicating themselves to producing this type of content is continually dropping. This does not mean that the media is no longer providing news, although this is definitely the case for some, especially certain radio stations. But now, a fair number of news media base their public interest news on content generated by other providers. From the beginning of our work, a study conducted in Baltimore in 2009 by the Pew Research Center has held our attention. How News Happens is the title. The researchers concluded that only about 17% of news contain original information, and that this came in large part from the traditional media. We commissioned a similar study on a smaller scale and with smaller means, of course, from Laval Université Centre d'études sur les médias. The results reflected those from the Pew Center. So the producers of original information freely provide their material to a growing number of other media providers who are therefore spared from having to invest in the production of new news, so to speak. I believe that we can conclude that without some rather strong-arm state intervention, the provision of original, diversified public interest news will continue to fade. This was the focus of our reflection. How far will this go? Already there are regions in Quebec with practically no more local or regional news. I can talk about that in a few minutes because it's very different from Ontario, and I should have something to explain about that. Especially because we don't have dailies as you have in small towns in Ontario, whereas most of our newspapers in the region are weekly newspapers. I picked up mine this week. This is my local newspaper. I'm not kidding, it's inside. I'll show you. These economic choices on the part of the news media are really not all that shocking. Media respond like any other business to the laws of the market, pushed public interest news to the side because the laws of the market now state that this type of news is not widely appreciated among significant swaths of the population, nor consequently by advertisers. For those who believe that news is a commercial product just like any other, this may be nothing serious. But numerous studies have long shown the news to play a fundamental role in feeding political debate and ensuring that individuals lead full and complete citizenship. My colleague, Henry Milner from Laval University's Political Science Department, has written a work on civic competence that fully illustrates this point. Civic literacy, how informed citizens make democracy work. According to Milner, the civic literacy of a nation and the quality of the news to which it has access are directly related. And he believes that Canada performs very poorly when it comes to civic literacy. As for regional and local news in particular, this serves as a motor for citizen involvement, as many studies have also demonstrated. New technologies now and mediums represent a real explosion of possibilities. The technology being developed today allows us to hope that access to information will become increasingly easier in the future and that a greater number of people will participate in its exchange. But we cannot ignore the fact that there are still great gaps. Unfortunately, not everyone has access to the same technology. This is why we have insisted on the importance of providing high-speed internet access throughout Quebec. And we want public measures for internet as well. Why include the internet in public measures? Because, contrary to what we might imagine, advertising companies are no more interested in financing public interest news on the internet than they are in its traditional forms. They are even less interested in the internet when it provides general news. A study that we commissioned from my colleague, Professor Desilets, clearly confirms this trend. Increasing the number of news vehicles or passing exclusively to the web will not be enough to make the news media industry profitable once again, especially not at the profit levels now expected by the industry, as profit expectations are higher today than ever before. So I know the idea of a status for a professional journalist is a cause for concern for many of you. And believe me, I would be strongly against if we cannot answer to this question, how can this be done while still preserving the crucial separation of state and the media? This is the primary issue. The second issue is to ensure that public money truly serves public information news. Financing the media, which is not often lacking for funds, does not offer the guarantee that their mission to provide information will be better served. In France, the Cardozo report insisted last year on this point when evaluating public funding effect on news. Numerous newspapers are developing commercial strategies outside of news provision, like crosswords, cooking, home decor, and inserts, etc., name it. We believe rather that we need to go through the journalist, the only ones whose mission is to inform and whose primary interest is to serve their readers, listeners, or viewers. The existence of a special status is key to achieving this and would be useful for numerous other reasons. Such a status is necessary so that journalists themselves can determine, thank you, who is a journalist, as the Tribune de la Presse or the Press Gallery is doing in the various Canadian legislations right now. It would therefore be journalists who determine to whom such state measures would apply, rather than this being a case of government intervention. Furthermore, this title would also allow the public to distinguish between professional journalists and other professional or amateur communicators, and would help protect the conditions under which journalism is practiced, particularly for independent and non-unionized journalists. Okay, it was not exactly for the Globe and Mail at first. Passing a law on the status of professional journalists in Quebec would also allow independent journalists to negotiate standards for contracts and minimum employment conditions. Employment conditions for independent journalists have seriously deteriorated over the past years, and their hiring by the media represents a heavy employment market trend in this industry. Their professional independence is at stake through these outdated employment conditions, and many young journalists must go through this. We suggest that financing part of the starting salary for new journalists would better serve their mission. Do you know that the Quebec government has done this in the video game industry since 1997, an economic decision that allowed Quebec to reach 6th position worldwide in this industry? We recommend financing news media through a tax credit of up to 38% of the salary during a minimum of 5 years in all news media outside of Montreal and Quebec City, and to finance all independent news media in Montreal or Quebec City, which are disappearing, as you may know. This proposal alone would require the introduction of a status for professional journalists. This would in no way involve a professional body modeled on the bar of the Collège des Médecins. The nuance is very important, and I allow myself to insist on it because the day after our report was published, the English press in Quebec began announcing that this was its primary recommendation, which is not the case. It's important to differentiate between a reserved title, which is the measure that we advocate, and a professional body, which would require the whole industry to hire only professional journalists. Besides, creating a professional body of journalists would clearly run counter to the provisions of freedom of expression. This is not what we are suggesting. In our proposal, news media could continue to hire who they chose. The wager we are making is that the benefits that professional journalists would possess in exchange for their adherence to a code of ethics would make media more inclined to hire them than other journalists. Would they absolutely have to have gone through journalism school? No, of course not. Possibly the organization that distributed the press card would accept a code of ethics exam, just as the Quebec Translators Association has people without diplomas pass a translation test. Possibly it would be otherwise. I don't want to decide, and I don't want the government to decide, but I do believe that today, more than ever, we have to keep this profession open and accessible to people with a variety of origins and backgrounds. This status should be attributed to journalists regardless of the type of media they work in, on the only basis of ethics involvement. Similarly, all news media should be encouraged to participate in the Quebec Press Council. I do not believe in a law forcing them to do so. We prefer the idea that they would receive benefits if they belonged to the council, namely in the form of tax credits I talked before. The Quebec Press Council is the body that should, in theory, self-regulate the news in Quebec. It's an honorary court whose decisions currently carry very little weight and to which the news media are not required to adhere. As you may know, Québécois Media left the council. This means 40% of the press industry in Quebec right now is outside of the regulation. The media would not be forced to adhere to its decision in this new plan, but there would be strong financial incentives to do so. We have also recommended that government publicity be attributed solely to media that belong to the council, that is, who adhere to the code of ethics. In sum, we are proposing a two-pronged structure that would bind professional journalists and news media under a single and recognized code of ethics. It's essential that not all the responsibility fall on the shoulders of journalists. There is great commercial pressure on journalists today. We hope to provide them with some respite and with the possibility of discussing with their employer on the basis of their code of ethics content that does not seem ethical to them, a dream for many today. It has been said that this will create two classes of journalists. I would like to point out that there already exists more than one class of journalists. First, there are those who benefit from the professional advantages of an ironclad collective agreement and who still find that their employer chooses commerce over public interest, as was revealed in an important survey by the Fédération of Journalists in Quebec. Then there are the journalists who have undergone very difficult labor relations in Quebec over the past year, lockout in the newsrooms, threats of definitely close down newspapers, etc. Of course, no incentives to protect the professional clauses. Then there are the others, those who have nothing, and their numbers are growing. The media are increasingly hiring freelancers, often young and inexperienced journalists, at conditions worse than those of 20 years ago. Nothing to help with compliance with ethics clauses. Declaring a professional status for journalists would in fact create the same obligations for all journalists and all news media, an end to competition over professional clauses, an end to second or third class journalists. Having a distinct professional status would not give courage to journalists who have none, but it would help those who do have some to justify their professional obligations. It's not the journalists that we want to protect, it's their way of working, their practice, caught up in today's vast communication maze. Furthermore, the status of professional journalist is not an end in itself. It must carry benefits so as to encourage journalists to claim it. Among these tools, I spoke earlier of sectional collective bargaining for independent journalists and freelancers, but figure two historical demands made by Quebec journalists: the right to anonymity of sources for professional journalists and priority access to government information. Now in Quebec, it's more complicated to obtain government information if you are a journalist. It's easier if you're a citizen. Concerning anonymity of sources, the two latest decisions from the Supreme Court of Canada on this subject both began with the notice that implied how the vagueness surrounding this profession prevented the court from granting protection of journalistic sources. The status of professional journalist could remove this ambiguity. In conclusion, I would like to add that there is nothing in this plan that takes anything away from anyone, contrary to the writings of certain popularity-seeking commentators. Nothing would prevent blogs from flourishing in all languages. Nothing would infringe on freedom of expression in Quebec. Quite the contrary. Nor is this a nostalgic project. Conversely, we would be developing modern communication as much as possible by putting it to the service of the population. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. As I said, we'll come to questions after everyone's spoken. Next, I'd like to introduce Ivor Shapiro. Ivor is the chair of Ryerson University School of Journalism. Ivor took over as chair this year, and I think probably has his work cut out for him. He teaches ethics and feature reporting, and he conducts research into many aspects of ethics and excellence in journalism. Ivor also chairs the Ethics Advisory Committee of the Canadian Association of Journalists and is the founding editor and current ethics editor of the Canadian Journalism Project's JSource, a really terrific website that provides news, commentary about issues in journalism, really has its pulse on all of these issues. So thank you, Ivor. Take it away.
Thank you, Kathy, and may I perhaps start on behalf of all of us for thanking Dominique for traveling and for putting up with our language difficulties and helping us understand truly what has been, I think quite clearly, a misreported, underreported story. Journalism education, my world, is an oddity. I make my living by seeking and passing on knowledge within what is known within the academy as a professional school, a professional program. But our graduates do not join a profession, at least not a profession in the sense that in which we understand the word with respect to doctors or lawyers, engineers. Lately in Ontario, formerly unregulated psychotherapists are now a regulated profession. That is a community of practice, a profession that is normally understood in society, but not always, is a practice, a community of practice that is supported by accredited education and whose members are subject to a formal system of self-regulation. So accredited education, self-regulation. That's what we normally understand, it seems, by the word profession. And in this sense, of course, journalism is not a profession, it's not yet a profession, and in that sense, nobody, as far as I know, has ever called for journalism to become a profession. Is it a profession in some kind of broader sense? And as with almost anything journalism related that I find myself talking about lately, the answer is probably maybe. Let me explain. But first, allow me, if I may, one important disclaimer. Some of my remarks may suggest a position on Professor Payette's proposals, or on the Quebec government's consultations in response to those proposals, or on the responses to those proposals by the Professional Federation of Quebec Journalists, the FPJQ, or by the Canadian Association of Journalists, which has taken the opposite position to the FPJQ, or they might suggest a position taken by the Ethics Advisory Committee of the Canadian Association of Journalists, of which I am chair, and any such thing would be a misunderstanding. I don't have enough command of French and therefore of the report, nor of the special conditions of Quebec journalism to take an informed position on those specifics. And the Ethics Advisory Committee was neither consulted by the CAJ's response, on the CAJ's response, nor would it have been, and has not yet had an opportunity to study that response. So all that said, as we have heard from Professor Payette herself this morning, the proposals made in her report are quite nuanced and nothing like the draconian idea of a license to practice journalism as has been widely misunderstood in the Anglophone media. And the ideas clearly stem, as we've heard, not from a desire to compromise the independence of the press or to regulate reporting in any way, but quite the contrary, from a careful and persuasive consideration of profound and troubling changes in the economic landscape of public interest journalism, and I dare to say not just in the province of Quebec, but in many other places. And nor is it only in Quebec that some have proposed a reconsideration of the idea of a professional status for journalists. The idea has been bubbling up in many quarters, especially academic quarters, and especially, I may say, in community journalism quarters in recent years. When I say community journalism, of course, I mean as opposed to big media. Some of the reaction to these ideas in general, and the Payette report in particular, have been substantially less nuanced, I would say, than the proposals themselves. I think that reflects, in part, a knee-jerk response of many journalists in Anglophone North America and the Commonwealth to any suggestion of a professional status for journalists. This, however, is not to say it is a knee-jerk response is not to say that the response is wrong or unhealthy. No professional physician, self-regulated as they are, certainly no neurologist would consider a knee-jerk response to be unhealthy. Quite the contrary. The response reflects in part a culture of autonomy and sheer orneriness, which could, like the literal knee-jerk, be considered very healthy indeed. Good for journalism in general, good for investigative journalism in particular, political and business reporting, and very good for democracy. But in part, these knee-jerk responses also stem from habituation to certain ways and certain ways of thinking for decades about the nature of freedom in general, and freedom of expression in particular, and about the nature of the social role of journalists. But there are many ways to understand the word profession. You look at a dictionary and you'll see many ways to understand the word. And the word that it is being used in the context of those who call for reevaluation is not, as again Dominique has so clearly emphasized, is not the same languages are used for lawyers or doctors or others. I think that the ways in which we understand this word profession can be understood as a kind of one of those lines on a graph that goes straight up, or some kind of curve. And if you think of the graph, you know, if we had a PowerPoint, I'd have it here, of course. But, you know, if you think of the graph as having one axis which is about the benefits of status, and another axis that's about the conditions of a status, the conditions as far as benefits and the conditions, there are various places on the spectrum that results between a formal status typified by doctors, a formal status which is highly restricted and highly conditional, in other words, but also has many benefits, monopolistic benefits. At the top end, the formal part of the graph. At the bottom end, you have other kinds of professional status that are far, far more informal. And in the sense that we are a professional program turning out a profession of journalists, in that sense, we're at the bottom end of the scale. It is a highly informal profession. And that is the case in most or all Commonwealth countries and in the United States. It's not the case, quite as much the case, on parts of the continent of Europe or in Latin America, where in Latin American countries, for example, journalists are licensed to practice through a sort of license to practice, through a requirement they be members of professional colleges and or have university degrees. That's pretty high up on the sort of formal side of the graph. Far down on that spectrum are countries like France and Belgium, which grant and have granted for many decades professional status to journalists. Journalists who make their living as journalists carry a card certifying that they do so and some benefits that accrue from carrying that card. So the question before us is really, if we think about professional status for journalists, is not, some dramatic new thing. It is about how much higher on the graph, from informal to formal, do we want journalism to go. And I think, obviously, that depends on, well, what are the benefits and what are the conditions, right? No one anywhere proposes giving a monopoly of journalism to, a monopoly on the practice of journalism to professional journalists. But there are a lot of proposed benefits that could be attained by moving us up that scale. If you like, as you again said, Dominique, if you like the idea, if you're a person who likes the idea of a shield law for journalists, you have to get involved with defining who the hell a journalist is. Otherwise, don't get involved in the idea of a shield law for journalists. It's obvious. One exemplary benefit is the conscience clause that was created pre-World War II in legislation in places like France and Italy, still in place, a protection offered to journalists from being fired because of their political views. This seems like a pretty good thing in principle, a protective mechanism for a healthy democracy, though my limited reading in the area suggests, and there are lots of lawyers in the room, hopefully some international ones, suggest that the case law on the conscience clause in Europe is neither exactly substantial nor exactly insignificant. In principle, anyway, a conscience clause seems to enhance individual freedom of expression and constrain corporate freedom of expression by constraining the power of an owner of a newspaper to decide who works for him or her. That's neither a good thing necessarily nor a bad thing necessarily, but it's what a conscience clause does. It enhances individual freedom and constrains corporate freedom. Another benefit, as in the experience of countries in Southern Europe, for example, is access to taxpayer subsidies. And Dominique has proposed one such form, a different form in Quebec. Travel discounts in Belgium on the national airline, the national travel lines for professional journalists. And this idea of state subsidies may sound in abstract like a terrible, terrible thing. He who pays the piper calls the tune. It's an open door to censorship. Well, hang on a moment. Ever heard of CBC Radio or Radio-Canada? Funded by taxpayers, not through a neutral automatic stipend like the BBC, but directly from parliamentary largesse. And don't CBC Radio-Canada, Harvey, others, Danny, don't they actually provide some of the best accountability journalism in this country and have done for many years? So likewise, experience with publicly subsidized news organizations in Southern Europe does not lend, and fostered by the professional status of journalists, does not lend support to the idea that subsidies lead inevitably to a weakened watchdog role. I'm not saying government largesse is a wonderful thing for journalists to depend on, but it hasn't killed us yet. A final benefit is access to places and to information. Certifiable journalists, you might say all journalists are certifiable, but certifiable journalists might get business class status to certain kinds of information. Dominique has talked about that. The only problem with that is not a problem for the journalists, but those who find a problem there find a problem for the others, the ones who are not certified. It seems to be, if I move ahead in the queue, well, sorry, but if you're in that queue, you move back. That's like duh, right? Let's face it, however, that barn door has been open for many, many years. Ever since the first hack put a press sign in his ad at a crime scene, if that ever happened outside the movies. The first time anyone accepted a press card for the Olympic Games, or an invitation to a closed press conference, or a place on a closed media call on a shareholder, on a quarterly report. The first time anyone accepted membership in a press gallery in a legislature. That's a door that's open to some and closed to others. I think we can see, however, that a more sweeping kind of government recognition for journalists, a permanent entitlement for a whole class of citizens at other citizens' expense, is of a different degree of magnitude. And the problem is, it's likely to be a grant that is not unconditional. So, which brings us to conditions. Do I get my status as a journalist by simply joining an organization? You know, somewhere in this briefcase there is a CAJ membership card, right? I've never shown it to anybody, and I don't know offhand where it is in my briefcase, and it doesn't get me a place up the line even in Tim Hortons, right? But I have a card. But all I do there is I pay my dues and I become a member. Or is it more stringent? Do I become certified by an industry commission, such as been proposed in Quebec, that creates a definition of journalist, and good luck with that one, and then declares that I match that definition somehow, that I do indeed earn part of my living, a serious part of my living, by working in this way? Might sound unfeasible, but that's exactly what happens in France since 1935. The French Statut de Journaliste it does exactly that. It does not seem to have killed journalism in Quebec. Or do I get my status, and here's where it gets a little bit murkier, and this is my closing question. Do I get my status by promising to abide by a code of conduct? In that case, that might be fine too, as long as I just promise and no one holds me to it. But of course, if there are benefits to carrying that card, government is probably going to say it should be more than me just promising. And it might limit my employment options if you or you think that I've broken my promise, that I've done the wrong thing in some way. And now you not only condemn me in public, which you're entitled to do, but you might limit my employment options, or you might limit my place in line for information or to access to government. You make me a second-class citizen. I don't care that I'm a second-class journalist, always was one. But I do care if I'm now a second-class citizen in line for government privileges. And I care and I think one needs, a powerful argument, a really powerful argument to restrict citizens' freedoms. It's not to say that every restraint on freedom of expression is a bad thing, but let's not waste time debating what that is. It is a restriction on freedom if one class of citizens has more access to things citizens have access to than other journalists. And that's my problem with all these discussions. But whatever, that's a beginning to a discussion. In short, those who seek special privileges for journalists under the law, for instance, the Shield Law, stand on very thin ice if they refuse to collaborate in defining who a journalist is. But those who seek to define who a journalist is must face up to the mighty problems that come with it of how to avoid defining what might disqualify citizens from things that citizens have a right to exercise. The smaller the benefits of professional status, the less rigorous the conditions of that status are likely to be. But the more substantial the benefit, the more rigorous the conditions will be, and the more troubling the whole idea will become. Journalists, after all, are not doctors with a power over life and well-being. We are not lawyers upholding the pillars of justice. We are not engineers inspecting the pillars of bridges. All that journalists do is this: we speak. And it might therefore be, after all, that freedom of speech, just speech, is the only freedom we should claim. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivor. I'll move on to our third speaker. Dr. Michael Geist is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, where he holds the Canada Research Chair in Internet and E-commerce Law. Dr. Geist is an internationally syndicated columnist on technology law issues, with his regular column appearing in the Toronto Star and the Ottawa Citizen. He's the author of several books on Canadian copyright law, the editor of several technology law publications, and the author of a really popular blog on the internet intellectual property law issues. Dr. Geist.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Kathy, and thanks so much, Professor Cameron, for the invitation. I'm an alumni of Osgood, and they say some things never change, but walking around this morning and seeing the incredible changes to this building, it's clear that some things do, and so much for the better. It's really nice to be back. And it's nice to have the opportunity to hear Dominique's presentation and to hear the actual recommendations unfiltered. and realize that there is, as we heard, a bit more nuance than some of the coverage that's been provided. That said, I want to provide my comments in responding, and they're going to be a bit critical of the proposal. I should start, though, and I guess you heard it a little bit in the introduction. Some of you may be asking, why is this guy even on the panel to begin with? And I think that's a totally fair question. I asked it, actually, when I was asked if I'd participate. And I should just note that I do wear a whole series of different hats. I mean, I feel like my day job is a law professor at the University of Ottawa, but I've written for the mainstream media since 1999, first for the Globe and more recently on a weekly basis for years now for the Toronto Star and the Ottawa Citizen. I also write, the same pieces appear in online publications as well, like the Tyee in Vancouver. And then I do a lot on social media as well, whether that's with a fairly well-trafficked blog or a large Twitter following, established a Facebook group for advocacy purposes that grew to nearly 100,000 people. So I wear a lot of different hats in this area, and I should note that my work often mixes opinion and legal information with what I would consider original reporting, often based on documents I've obtained through access to information, sometimes through leaks. So I wear a series, as I say, of different hats, and in talking about the proposal that we've heard come out of Quebec, I would say that I've got a couple of concerns. In part, I think it asks some of the right questions and gives the wrong answers, but perhaps even more importantly, doesn't ask all of the right questions, at least based on what we've heard here. With respect to the right questions, I think the focus on media concentration, and I think anyone in the rest of Canada feels the same sort of pressures when it comes to media concentration as we heard about in Quebec. It's clearly here as well. What I heard in that presentation are really two main concerns. One is, how do we fund original public interest reporting, particularly investigative journalism, at a time when there are increasing cost pressures on media organizations? The advertising models are clearly changing, sometimes more towards niche, sometimes more towards online, whether that's online journalism or even just online services like Craigslist and the like, and advertisers themselves demanding ever more metrics about the effectiveness of the advertising. The old saw about advertising works 50% of the time, you just don't know which 50%. May have worked at one point in time, but in a world of Google where you do have click-through rates and the like, increasingly advertisers demand more information about how effective their campaigns are. So I don't think there's any doubt that that's a real issue. So too is the real issue of how to deal with inequitable contracts for journalists, particularly for freelancers or people who are newly entering the profession, given that media concentration in Quebec and frankly I would say here in the rest of Canada as well. I think those are the right questions. But I have to say with all respect that I think the notion of a status of journalist or accreditation backed by tax breaks doesn't solve either of those issues. With respect first to the issue of tax breaks for hiring, I think that at the end of the day it does little to address the broader underlying economic challenges that are faced by media organizations today. I'm largely in agreement with people like Clay Shirky on this, who is of the view that there is a foundational shift that is taking place in the way that news is being gathered and reported, and that the extent to which there may have been exclusivity, or not quite a monopoly, but a certain advantage with fewer voices for large organizations has changed, as sources of information are now far more wide and varied than they were before, largely in the move towards online, and I'd argue that that is a feature, not a bug. For the mainstream media, of course, that represents a significant challenge, and it means in many instances trying to expand their holdings and operations to generate revenue that extend well beyond traditional publications, and I think we see that from a lot of organizations, of course, including Torstar, where there's much more focused on the web, on social media, and on complementary businesses that will allow for some of that revenue generation from other sources. That's an economic model, and there may well be other economic models, but I suppose I find myself quite skeptical with the notion that subsidizing a small part of your workforce through tax dollars does little to change that larger foundational shift and therefore address the larger economic realities that would support original investigative journalism. I think the challenges that journalists face in trying to engage in that reporting is neither a function of desire or a lack of courage. It's clearly none of those. And in many ways, it's about the bigger economic picture. And accreditation might provide, or status might provide better access, but I have to say there's little reason to believe that the mainstream media will increase the amount of coverage because of it. In many instances, there already is the privileged access that Ivor talked about, and we know that we're facing this significant challenge. I also think that the inequitable contracts are a big problem. I should say, being a freelancer for a number of publications, I've signed some of those. But it isn't clear at all to me why tax breaks would change those broader contractual negotiations. For freelancers who were previously accustomed to being able to sell off their work for a number of different platforms in a post-Ticini, Robertson world, whether in the US or Canada, or I assume in many other places, the reality is that publishers demand all rights on all platforms. That isn't about to change. And so I don't think that we can change the economics of those kinds of negotiations through subsidies or through tax breaks. It's largely a matter, I think, of supply and demand. If we can increase the demand for journalism, and frankly, I think that's where online increasingly comes in, then those that produce the very best of that journalism will find their work more in demand, and there will be more opportunities for the economic benefits that arise from that. In fact, I'd argue that tax breaks for new journalists entering into the profession might actually hurt the desire to increase the amount of investigative original reporting, because it might mean that there are some organizations that would begin to shift some of their resources from the experienced investigative journalists already on staff towards some of the newer, inexperienced journalists, because it begins to make economic sense to do so. If we start seeing pressures to actually shift away from the very people who bring years of experience, because it takes years of experience to know how to do these sorts of things, to hire people who are new on the job, perhaps in the longer term, there may be some benefits, but I fear that we will enter into a continual cycle where just as you've gone through those initial years of someone becoming a strong, effective investigative journalist, suddenly they no longer make economic sense because there's a tax break for someone who comes new to the profession. And so because of that, I actually fear it may result in less original reporting, not more. But what I really want to spend my time on quickly is that I think that fundamentally this asks the wrong question. I think trying to foster investigative journalism isn't about saving or even really trying to assist the mainstream media. I think they're already engaged in some amazing investigative journalism, though the pressures are there. I think increasingly it's about focusing on the online side, on online journalism and online journalists, where I believe that much of the new innovation is coming right now. There are sites and services like Global Voices, the project that originated out of Harvard University that brings the voice of bloggers from around the world, original voices from many communities where now, at a time when large media organizations are closing their foreign bureaus, this is where often you get original reporting from people who are on the ground, and it's largely bloggers who are doing it. There's, of course, the social media reporting that we see, the eyewitness accounts, that isn't investigative, of course, but plays such a crucial role in our ability to understand and see what is taking place, often in real time. There's things like the Twitter curation that we've started to see from people like Andy Carvin at NPR or Katie O'Malley from the CBC, who sits in on various committee hearings and provides real-time updates for what's taking place, shedding new light on processes that for many were largely hidden in the past. And it's worth noting that both of those individuals work for public broadcasters. There are online publications like the Tyee and others who are experimenting with new economic models like foundational support and reader support to ensure that issues get investigated and covered in ways that they aren't currently covered elsewhere. There are the bloggers that often do engage in original reporting and obtaining original documents. In fact, I'd argue that very often the way the reporting takes place is that journalists look to experts, whether that's at public interest groups or academia, for context and better information for some of the things that they've discovered. In some ways, we're starting to see those academics and those public interest groups do some of the original reporting on their own and then have the tools, of course, to make it more widely available. And then there's, of course, the crowdsourced efforts as well. Things like WikiLeaks, which I recognize has been much criticized, but much of the analysis that will take place on the WikiLeaks cables, for example, will ultimately come from individuals. About 10,000 cables were released that were assessed by The Guardian, by others. There's about 240,000 others that will ultimately depend on the public to spend time to go through and try to identify whether there is something worth calling attention to. So there's a lot of innovation there, but make no mistake, there is a lot of risk as well. And some of the risks that is faced from an online perspective include the biggest risk of all, life and liberty. If you go to a site like Reporters Without Borders and take a look at imprisoned journalists, they don't bother trying to define the issue. They note people who are engaged in journalism ought to be considered journalists, especially in countries where people find themselves in jail for engaging in the practice. If you take a look at the list, you will find that bloggers make up a significant portion of the people who are listed. Whether in Egypt, China, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Vietnam, Mexico, Turkey, or others, all countries that currently have people who are either bloggers or people who have worked for online media who find themselves in jail today. Those risks are real. Costs and access is real as well. This notion with respect of business class for professionally accredited or journalists that have a certain status does mean that those that want to engage in access to information request or other sorts of information gathering, engaging in the practice of journalism, necessarily take a back seat. And make no mistake, they already take a back seat in the sense that the costs that I spend, often out of my own grants, to try to fund some of the access information requests can run into the thousands of dollars. That's tough to do for individuals. There's intermediary liability issues as well. The WikiLeaks situation highlighted the ability for various intermediaries, whether payment intermediaries or hosts, to shut down these kinds of sources. Amazon, as a cloud service, shut down all these various sorts of sources so that where those journalists speak out, and often the reason they find themselves in jail is that they are willing to push the envelope in a way that those within the mainstream cannot because of the organizations that they are with, they often find themselves significantly at risk. In fact, ironically, I did a piece a number of years ago called "We Are All Journalists Now," that when posted on the blog generated a number of comments, including one that led to allegations of defamation. I didn't take down the comment as quickly as the person who believed they were being defamed thought I should have, and I ultimately found myself in a lawsuit alongside many mainstream media organizations. It's the Crooks case, for those that are wondering. Ultimately, that case went to the Supreme Court, and no surprise, it's the large media organizations that were able to deal with Wayne Crooks the easiest. It was those that are individual bloggers or online media that were by far at the greatest risk for those sorts of issues. There are protections for those kinds of sites and journalism activities in the United States. There are not in Canada. And finally, there are economic issues and economic risks that those online sites face as well. We already have various sorts of mechanisms to allow the mainstream media to benefit, things like simultaneous substitution and other sorts of tax breaks from an advertiser perspective. If we're serious about fostering what we see taking place online, we ought to see mechanisms to try to shift some of those opportunities to online media as well.
Thank you, Michael. I'm cognizant of the time. In an ideal world, I'd be able to give each of you a chance to respond, and you again. But I think that we're supposed to go till 10:30. Can we go to 10:40? And then we'll take a break. So let's go straight to questions. I think that, again, this is a unique opportunity. We have Dominique here. People put a lot of thought in looking at some of this. So let's open it to questions. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you go to the mic, please, and identify yourself and ask your question? Thank you.
I'm sorry, we can't hear. Not working.
Is it on?
I need it.
I have a question for Michael. My name is Madeline. I'm with the City of Vaughan. I deal with media. I deal with communication. And there seems to be right now an issue in that some experts believe that social media is just there. And then there are other experts that believe that social media is the future. And I'd like your opinion on social media.
Well, I think it's both there and part of the future. I'm obviously, as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of social media and the kind of impact that it has, and it's both as a reporting tool as well as a source of information and interaction and communication. I think that what we're seeing right now is a blurring of the lines between social media and conventional media as well. I think, for example, of the way the last federal election was covered. And if you were following the reporters who were following the politicians, it was in many ways, they said it wasn't a Twitter election, but basically almost all the coverage was taking place on Twitter in real time, in a way that was, I think, interesting both for the political parties themselves and political operatives who were in a position to better identify what was taking place in rival campaigns, but for anyone who wanted to really cover this, by the time the conventional news story was coming out from those same journalists, whether in print or online or through radio or video, most of us had already seen it already. And so I think we are seeing a real blurring as mainstream media increasingly uses those same social media tools because that's where the audience is. But of course, many others who may not be with mainstream media organizations but have the same ability to use those same sorts of tools to reach much the same kind of audience.
And just one other question as a follow-up to that. Social media is two-way conversation. Do you believe that if social media is utilized as a push-out vehicle, that it will not be successful, that followers will lose interest? So for example, if you're tweeting, I mean, it's been great for political campaigns because you're pushing out information, but it becomes very dangerous when it's two-way because then you're expected to provide responses.
I don't know that I describe it as dangerous, but I do think that that those that use the media social media to actually engage, not only do it far better, but are far more likely to have credibility and find an audience, and that applies in many, for many different organizations or individuals. Just to give you quickly an example. When not the last copyright bill, Bill C-11, was just introduced a couple of weeks ago, but its predecessor, C-32, was introduced. Both at the time, the two ministers, James Moore and Tony Clement, took to Twitter in vastly different ways to promote the bill. You had James Moore using it largely as a one-way mechanism, at least at first, where he was tweeting out a whole series of organizations that were speaking positively about the bill. And then you had Tony Clement engaging with people who were asking questions about the legislation. And I thought it was quite amazing, frankly, to see a cabinet minister asking questions from the public within hours of a piece of legislation being introduced. But more than that, those that were taking a look at the bill and took a look at the respective ministers, I think, came away with, at least at that time, a lot more respect for Minister Clement for the way he was actually trying to engage, as opposed to Minister Moore, who at the time was using this largely as just a PR mechanism.
Thank you, and a very interesting presentation by the panel this morning. Thanks again.
Can I say something on that, please? In French, we don't speak about social media because there's no mediation. We're talking about social networks. And the problem with the social networks is not that you can talk to someone. It's not because it's bidirectional. If it's a danger if we don't have something on the side, if you don't have mediation on the side. And this is crucial to understand that this is journalism that is doing this mediation. And social networks are not mediated. And I just want to say something else to Michael. Well, do you know, Michael, that the average number of journalists in weekly newspapers in Quebec is 1.5? This is the average. So in many newspapers in Quebec regions, there's only one journalist. And they are trying to shift to internet sites. And they want to do updating, daily updating with 1.5 journalists. And I think that hiring is a real concrete problem. And just another thing very, very quickly, we can avoid very easily the fight between old and younger journalists just by according measures, tax measures, on the global, Julian, masse salariale. Yeah, so they cannot go under the masse salariale, and it's a very easy way to avoid this fight between young and old journalists.
The median wage, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Paul Knox. I have a question, I guess, for Dominique. I mean, I just wonder how you respond to some of the points that Michael and Ivor made, specifically with respect to the question of what Michael described as subsidies, but things such as the direction of government, the potential direction of government advertising to favoritism, effectively, in the distribution of government advertising and the benefits of that. Favoritism by publicly owned corporations in the distribution of things like preferential pricing on airline seats and so on. It's very difficult for me to understand how this does not become a benefit which, when bestowed, can also be withdrawn. And the question then arises, who makes the decision as to whether the person has transgressed a code of conduct, a code of ethics, whatever you want to call it, for how long is the person suspended for from these privileges. It's very, very difficult, particularly for those of us who've worked in countries where governments do have these levers to control what happens and use them very effectively in very sophisticated ways. Very difficult to believe that they would not become politicized and that we would actually wind up in a worse mess than we are now. It's very difficult to understand how these benefits would outweigh the drawbacks. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I understand. Two things on that. First of all, I worked for 30 years at Radio-Canada, and never, ever anybody told me what to say and what not to say. And the other one is, you know, now there is some patronizing very important in Quebec because at the regional and municipal level, mayors are deciding to which newspaper they are giving avis légaux et juridiques. Someone can translate?
Louder?
Yeah. And this is sometimes up to $60,000 a year. And they are, right now, they are choosing if it's this newspaper or the other one. And on what basis are they choosing, do you believe? Really? So we want journalists decide that. And this is the only way. I know it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge to journalists to decide who is a journalist and to decide who is going to receive these subsidies.
But how do you avoid the manipulation of that process? Governments will simply insert themselves into the process by favoring certain journalists who are on a decision-making process.
Why?
Because it's in their interest to do so. You've given them the tools and the levers to do that.
Yeah, but journalists are intelligent persons, and they're going to see that, and we can have an appeal committee, and there are many ways to protect themselves against that. You know, I know that. How can I say that? Well, CBC and Radio-Canada, as Ivor said, is the biggest employer of journalists in this country. Yes, but we have to find some arm's length. This is our work to imagine something.
Okay, we can maybe continue this discussion outside. Can we move on to another question, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Kathy. Mark Stevens, I have some questions for Dominique, really. If we all believe that in a democratic society we should receive all shades and colours of opinion, we clearly distort the marketplace with the proposals that you come forward with. The second question I have is, how do you reconcile your proposals with the rights, the international law rights which form part of Canadian law, which might best be encapsulated in Article 19 of the UN Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, where people have the right, citizens have the right to impart information unintermediated without benefits or special access. And perhaps more importantly, the right of the general public, which is the underpinning, if you like, of the right to receive in all shades and colours of opinion, the right to receive information from all shades and colours of opinion, absent some pressing social need, without there being any intermediation in that process. And it seems to me that I can't reconcile those fundamental principles, and I always go back to fundamental principles when a proposition such as this is put forward. I can't reconcile how you can reconcile that with international law.
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so what I can say is that in Union Européenne, the status of journalists is recognized, and many decisions are well, can I say that? Yeah, many decisions are very favorable, very going in the sense of a professional status for journalists.
Yeah, I mean, I think, may I?
Yes, please.
I mean, it seems to me that some of this discussion, both this question and Paul's, seems to be predicated on ignoring that we're not talking not we, but the proposals are not talking about a new concept here. We're talking about a concept that has been in existence for many decades in Europe, and the European Code of Human Rights does not appear to have been found to have a problem with that.
Well, hang on a second. There is an issue here, which is the fact that it's been doing for a long time doesn't make it right. You've got to go back and actually look at it in conjunction with international treaties and obligations. And, you know, I practice perhaps more regularly on speech issues before the European Court than anyone in the world. I mean, I've had 5 cases this year. I mean, I am completely unaware of any cases about the licensing or status of journalists within the jurisprudence. And it may be, as is very often the case within the European Court, that because people in Belgium and France are used to this kind of situation, they don't challenge it. And of course, the real issue about the status of journalists and whether journalists should get preferential treatment has started to evolve partly because of the way in which new technology has come forward in the last couple of years. So I'm not sure that answers it for me.
But may it not be, Mark, that the reason that nobody has expressed a problem before the courts with the status in France and Belgium and Italy and so forth is that nobody has a problem, that it hasn't actually turned out to be a problem for citizens as much as might in theory be the case. I mean, we're not talking, Canada is not Latin America. I mean, I'm not, as you gather, I'm not in favor of extending this right, but it does seem to me that of an enhanced status, I mean necessarily, but it does seem to me that the answer has to be, it depends on the benefits and the conditions. And I think that's also the answer to Paul's question. It's like, we already have access privileges, and also, Michael, it seems to me, the idea of this two-class thing that you're concerned about, all journalism is now online journalism and digital journalism, and why would we assume that a blogger, whatever that may mean, is not a professional status journalist? Why would we assume that? The benefits and conditions of membership may well be exactly right for someone who does all of his or her journalism digitally.
And on your first comment, is it a way of interfering in the marketplace? Yes, of course.
Of course.
Because I think that the market laws are not protecting journalism practices right now, not at all. And right now, journalism in this country is defining by judges and by the market laws. And I think we deserve better than that.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions. I said there's many more questions, and I think they will unravel through the day as well. So you've been waiting. Please go ahead.
My name is Omar Haredai. I'm an author, blogger, a freelancer, and unfortunately at times also a lawyer. And I share the quite dubious distinction and recent distinction with Mr. Geist as being one of the most influential social media people in Canada. So the question that I have, and it emerges from the program, is should bloggers, tweeters, and others be considered journalists? And I don't think I actually had that question explicitly answered. The reason why I'm asking it is on my reading of the Grant case, it appears as if bloggers are referenced as journalism for the first time in that case, as I understand it in the case law. And from that, it emerges then, does the defense of responsible communication, is it applied uniformly then to all journalists, or is this a gradient? And then will bloggers, who sometimes do engage in investigative journalism but don't have the same resources to do so, are they held to the same standard as mainstream journalists?
Great question. Who would like to take that on?
I'll take it.
Okay.
With a question. Hands up, the journalists in this room. Okay, put your hands down if you're not also a blogger or a tweeter. See what I mean? Like, of course, bloggers and tweeters are recognized as journalists. Journalists are bloggers and tweeters. They'd be fools not to be involved in digital media.
I think that's becoming an old question, truthfully. But Michael?
Yeah, but when you ask in an audience, not this audience, but in many other audiences, how many of you are bloggers and tweeters, you might get many hands that go up, but then if you say, keep your hand up if you're also a journalist, I think many would put their hands down. And so while it may be true that journalists, in the conventional sense, are bloggers and tweeters and tweeters don't always necessarily think of themselves as journalists, but they may practice what we would consider to be journalism, at least journalism that is at times in need of the sorts of protections that journalists often take for granted or believe that are essential to be able to practice their craft. And so to me the question is, it isn't about journalists, it's about journalism. And where you engage in that, it shouldn't matter whether or not you are a professionally accredited or have the status of a journalist. Protections ought to be equal.
Right. And at the heart of that, there's journalism practices and code of ethics. And that's all.
Okay, one last...
And to emphasize that, you know, when the Supreme Court of Canada said, we won't do a responsible journalism defense in Canada, we'll do this responsible communication defense, where did it look for its definition of what responsible communication was? Journalism. And it said so. Yeah.
Yes, and that decision also talked about highest journalistic standards and leaving the question of who defines that.
Yes, thank you. My name is Peter Jenkins, and the question I have is just sort of a bit of a follow-on to the whole issue of who is a journalist, and I'm interested in the whole topic of WikiLeaks. I know Mr. Geist brought it up briefly, but there has been a campaign in the media in the United States particularly and all around the world to demonize Julian Assange and really to characterize him as a sort of as a source who lurks in the shadows rather than a bona fide journalist in his own right, and sort of getting into the whole issue of the independence of the media in situations where it's sponsored by the state. I heard a documentary on National Public Radio a while ago, which is very inflammatory and very negative towards Julian Assange, sort of characterizing him as this dirty, unwashed source who lurks in the shadows rather than a bona fide journalist, also demonizing Bradley Manning, the alleged source of the documents, and impugning that he was mentally unbalanced. A very inflammatory documentary, by NPR, which is financed by the state. So I'm wondering, this whole argument that subsidy of media doesn't affect its objectivity is fine and dandy in terms of peace and prosperity, but in terms of national crisis, and turmoil, upheaval, war, perhaps the objectivity of media that's funded by the state is very much suspect, and I'm just wondering what the comments of the panel are on that.
I think that's a really big question, so I'm going to just ask who wants to quickly answer it, and then maybe we could continue. You could continue that discussion outside, because I think we need to take a break and move on.
Yeah, maybe Ivor.
It's really big.
It's too big for me. Sorry.
All right. So since I'm not the journalist, I'm happy to answer. I think that the coverage from much of the mainstream media of WikiLeaks was positively shameful. They continually, when this first happened, I thought misled the public to suggest that WikiLeaks had simply released 250,000 cables without anything more. That's not at all what happened. All those documents only finally came out once a reporter at The Guardian, through his book, had actually disclosed the key that actually allowed the stuff that with the cables that were floating around to be more readily accessed. There's plenty of mud or blame to be had for both sides on that. But the public was giving, I think, a real misconception. And then if you take a look at the response, and I alluded to it in my comments, by many intermediaries, that is, for me, where the real chill from the WikiLeaks story comes from. The notion that a call from Senator Joe Lieberman can be enough to shut down a website, can be enough to shut down domain names, can be enough to have the major payment providers in the world stop taking payments on behalf of an organization that has not been found to have violated anything. Bradley Manning may have, although he continues to sit in jail without any formal charges, is not only shameful, but ought to put a chill in anyone, because now we are not talking about countries that we think don't have democratic processes. We're talking about the United States of America.
Okay,
and would
thank
this
you.
apply even doubly to institutions which are funded by the state as well? I mean, if even a mainstream
we
privately funded organization.
really have to move on. We've got a really busy day today. So can we talk outside?
Yes. Thank
Okay.
you, Mr. Geist.
Thank you. We're going to take a coffee break. How long, Jamie?
Popping up to remind everyone, if you could please route all comments through the mics. It's great to have a high level of participation, but we are videotaping the conference, and so I'd like to just request, and I'll remind the moderators, please let's have our comments through the microphones. I want to thank the panel, the first panel, for starting this off. It's been a great start. I haven't said this before, but I want to thank those who have traveled from some distance to join us here today. Ivor's been teasing me for weeks now about making the trip north. So we're very grateful that Ivor was able to make that effort, but others came further. Michael is a former student. We're delighted to have him back. He's here from Ottawa, and Dominique, as you know, came from Quebec City. So please join me in thanking the panel. And our next panel is going to be a blockbuster too. We're going to try and start right at 11 o'clock sharp, and this is the information you're all waiting to hear. Washrooms. If you go out the moot court room, take a left about halfway down the hallway there. Take another left, and you'll see signs to the washrooms. There are also washrooms upstairs. There are refreshments. See you back again at 11.